Back in the city of Neverwinter, Roland was working in his office. Normally, the person sitting by his side would be Nightingale, but today, it was Anna who was sitting there. Glancing at the slender long legs seated on the desk, he blushed slightly. Anna smiled gently and asked if he was feeling unaccustomed to the change. Roland, feeling a bit awkward, scratched the back of his head. As it turned out, during Nightingale's absence, the responsibility of guarding the king had been passed on to Anna. Before departure, Anna had also instructed Nightingale to take good care of everyone before watching the ship set sail. In the office, Anna took Roland's hand, noticing his concern for the upcoming Snowy Mountain expedition. She reassured him that with 50 God's Punishment witches, 500 elite First Army soldiers, and the sisters from the Witch Union, no one could harm them. Not long after, Phyllis entered the office. This surprised Roland a bit since he had assumed she would be interested in the expedition. It turned out that Phyllis stayed behind because Pasha wanted her to. Being the most familiar with the castle among the Takira witches, she was the best candidate for the bodyguard. Leaving a God's Punishment witch to guard the castle was actually a request from Pasha herself as well. Although Anna's abilities were strong, her ability would be ineffective against the Stone of God Punishment. Anna is super smart, however, his strength does not lie in her combat abilities. Considering these factors, Pasha insisted on having a God's Punishment which is a close bodyguard. Roland nodded, thanking Phyllis for her assistance. Phyllis bowed and then headed out, but before she left, she told Roland she would be waiting in the hall at all times. If he ever needed her, she would be here right away. She then turned to both of them with a slight smirk, suggesting they didn't need to mind her and could continue what they were doing, which made both of them blush. Late at night, after returning to the castle and after round 1, Roland asked Anna if she would find it boring to be in the office every day. Anna shook her head, saying she could still do her own daily work while accompanying Roland. She even thought Roland might grow tired of seeing her every day. Hearing this, Roland flipped over, pinning Anna beneath him, wanting to prove just how untired of her he was. Well, the details that follow are best left to the imagination. After a long while, we once again returned to the dream world, where Roland opened his eyes and stretched out his arms. Looking around, the familiar settings made him realize that he was once again in the dream world. As Roland was eating breakfast prepared by Zero, she wondered why he got up so late today. After a quick wash in the bathroom, Roland joked about being an adult who enjoys nightlife and sleeping in on his days off. Zero teased him, pointing out that Roland always comes home early and seems like the kind of uncle without a career or a girlfriend. Roland almost choked on his mouthwash at that comment. He wanted to argue but decided not to bother with a little brat and instead loudly declared he was going on a date soon. After getting dressed in a new suit, Roland headed to the neighboring apartment. This wasn't really a date, but a scheduled meeting. He didn't want to be looked down upon in front of little Zero. Just as he was about to knock, he heard a scream from his own suite. The person screaming was no other than Zero. Turning around, he saw her panic-stricken, running out of the apartment. Roland initially thought Zero might have seen a mouse, but she stammeringly pointed at the door, saying there was a strange person in the house. Rushing back, Roland discovered a strange woman in their room, wearing a long robe. However, she was very beautiful. Zero, hiding behind Roland, nervously mentioned she heard Roland leave and was checking if the door was properly locked when she turned around to find someone suddenly behind her. The woman turned around at the noise, and Roland instinctively clenched his fists. He was shocked when the woman happily yet uncertainly called him Your Majesty Roland. Hearing this, both Zero and Roland were stunned. Roland cautiously asked who she was, and to his surprise, she said she was Phyllis, who seemed confused by the current situation just as he was. A series of questions flooded Roland's mind, especially how Phyllis could enter this dream world and why Anna couldn't. Zero, sensing something was off, quickly asked if they knew each other and why she called Roland Your Majesty, wondering if they were playing some role-playing game. Roland found himself having to concoct an excuse, telling Zero that the stranger was a relative of his and that the Your Majesty title was just a joke. Now somewhat calmer but still curious, Zero had more questions, especially since Roland had appeared just as scared as she was and had asked the stranger for her identity. Roland, keeping his composure, deflected by joking that he had seen a scaredy cat screaming her head off, nearly wetting her pants, which caused Zero's cheeks to flush with embarrassment. Before she could retort, Roland pulled her aside, whispering that Phyllis had been there all along and Zero simply hadn't noticed while busy with her homework, signaling Phyllis to leave quickly. However, Phyllis, being astute, hurried to explain she hadn't intended to scare her. She had wanted to greet Zero upon seeing Roland leave, but Zero had run out screaming. Roland quickly reassured Zero that it was all a misunderstanding, exacerbated by her initial scream. Zero, momentarily speechless and on the verge of tears, seemed to be deeply embarrassed. Feeling he might have been too harsh, Roland gently patted the little girl's head, assuring her it was all a misunderstanding, and suggested she return to her studies. Zero, holding back tears, angrily kicked Roland on the shin before storming off to her room, leaving Roland jumping from the pain. Phyllis couldn't help but laugh, remarking that in this place, Roland did not seem like the supreme mortal king back in Grey Castle. Roland, with a smile, said that might be true, however, he was also the master and only ruler of this world. He then invited Phyllis to his room as he had many questions for her. After some while, their conversation confirmed that the woman before him was indeed the real Phyllis, as she mentioned details about Takira, being number 76, and Grey Castle. However, Roland was puzzled about how Phyllis had entered this world, especially appearing as her true self rather than in her god's punishment body. Phyllis explained she was unclear herself. She had meant to enter a deep sleep to regenerate her stamina, and the next thing she saw was finding herself here upon waking. Roland then explained that this place was what he called the dream world, a world that he could only enter while sleeping. While Roland found it odd to have an outsider enter his dream world, he decided to conduct some tests. First, he brought out a ladder, explaining that falling from a height in this world typically sent him back to the real world. He then asked Phyllis to try it and mentioned they would meet again in the castle hall afterward. Unexpectedly, Phyllis suddenly grabbed his arm, a move that took him by surprise. The next moment, Phyllis asked if Roland could pinch her with all his strength. Confused, Roland watched as Phyllis rolled up her sleeve, exposing her arm and insisting on being pinched as hard as he could. Oof, I'm not sure where this is going. Roland initially thought she wanted to use pain to wake up, but suddenly, Roland remembered that once a witch becomes a god's punishment, witches they lose their sense of feeling pain. Realizing her intent, Roland hesitated for a moment before reaching out and twisting her arm with considerable force. Phyllis clenched her teeth, emitting a deeply satisfied moan from her throat as her body trembled. Oh, man, what's happening here? Meanwhile, Zero came out of her room to get some water. However, she saw that the two were no longer in the living room. Turning around, she saw Roland's door being locked. Curious, she leaned against the door and immediately heard a series of indescribable moans, which made her blush and feel embarrassed. Inside the room, Phyllis let out a sigh of relief. Clasping her hands together, she said she could finally feel pain again. Her cheeks were still very flushed, as if, well, you know what I mean. At this moment, Phyllis seemed like a different person, her eyes almost shining as she looked at Roland. Roland let out a shrug while saying Phyllis could do it herself. Hearing this, she shook her head, saying it wasn't the same, suddenly knelt down on one knee, and said earnestly that although this world might be just a dream to him, she was willing to give everything. She wasn't sure if she could return here in the future. All she wanted to ask Roland to let her stay here a little longer. Roland took a deep breath, thinking that the Takira witches like Phyllis hadn't felt her senses for over 400 years. To him, this world was just a bizarre fictional place, but for Phyllis, it must be a long-desired dream world. However, it was too cruel for Phyllis to come to a long-lost dream world only to experience pain again. Roland sighed softly, reached out to help her up, and decided to conduct a test later. After standing up, Phyllis once again bowed to him by lifting her hands to her chest, she finally understanding why the witches in the Witch Union loved Roland so much. Roland was about to say something when the bedroom door was suddenly knocked loudly, and Zero's voice came from outside, telling them that the tea was ready and asking if they wanted any. Roland opened the door, only to see a little Zero with empty hands. Her face was somewhat red but seemed a bit angry. She peeked in, scrutinizing Phyllis up and down with a wary eye. When asked where the tea was, Zero told him to fetch it himself, then pointed at the two of them, telling them not to make strange noises. After closing the door again, Phyllis, curious, asked about the relationship between the two. Roland did not explain much, and seeing that Roland did not want to elaborate, she did not ask further. Biting her lip with some anticipation, she looked at Roland, hoping he would try a few more times in other ways, doing her best to make no sound. Roland, feeling a bit overwhelmed, decided to take Phyllis out for a stroll, thinking it would be a good distraction. Phyllis was initially surprised, worrying it might inconvenience Roland. However, he assured her that in this world, she could be considered a celebrity, hinting at the differences between this dream world and their reality on how everyone sees witches and their power. Phyllis's excitement grew, especially at the prospect of exploring whether this world had taverns and hotels. Why does she want to visit a hotel? Anyway, suddenly, Roland remembered he had plans and made a phone call to cancel. No doubt, the loud complaints from Garcia on the other end of the line made Roland turn away, her anger palpable even through the speaker. Roland explained he had a guest over, leading to a brief silence followed by Garcia saying that she would come to him instead. When Roland said he wasn't at his apartment, Garcia raised her voice again, furious about him canceling a meeting she had arranged with a senior member of her association, accusing him of irresponsibility. The taxi driver caught the words about not taking responsibility and gave Roland a peculiar look, prompting Roland to pretend the signal was bad and hang up. Zero, sitting between them, scoffed at Roland's cliché excuse. Meanwhile, Phyllis was glued to the window, amazed by everything outside, earning envious glances from the taxi driver. Before leaving, Roland had picked out a new set of clothes for Phyllis, and they eventually stopped at a fast food restaurant. Phyllis, following Roland's advice, had kept her curiosity in check, mimicking the actions of others around her despite the novelty of it all. However, when she took a bite of the hamburger Roland handed to her, tears uncontrollably streamed down her face, overwhelming her with emotion. Zero was confused by Phyllis's reaction. Roland, taking a deep breath, explained that Phyllis's family treated her poorly and she hadn't had a proper meal in a long time. This explanation softened Zero's expression, likely evoking a sense of empathy and making the little girl think about herself. As Zero now affectionately called Phyllis Big Sister, Roland watched the ancient Takira which tearfully devouring the fast food, a mix of emotions stirred within him. What was a simple pleasure for him represented a dream worth sacrificing everything for in their eyes. Uncertain if there would be another opportunity like this, he resolved to make the most of their time together, fulfilling her desires as much as possible in this dream world. Every bite filled Phyllis with happiness, drawing astonished looks from other fast food restaurant patrons due to the array of meal boxes spread across their table, which would be enough for more than a dozen people. Zero wiped Phyllis's mouth while watching her eat. Once Phyllis had nearly finished, Roland inquired if she had noticed anything strange before coming here. Glancing at Zero beside her, Phyllis quickly grasped his meaning and explained that the dreams of her past were long gone, nothing special, just leaning against the wall and cutting off consciousness as before to aid her recovery while maintaining vigilance. Roland asked if she could still sense changes in her surroundings after disconnecting her consciousness. Phyllis nodded, saying that even as her consciousness sank into darkness, she could still feel danger around her. It was not through sight or sound, and she couldn't explain it very well. Zero, eating ice cream while pouting, didn't understand a word they were saying. Roland suggested that if Zero was bored, she could walk around the nearby park. The little Zero huffed discontentedly and left the restaurant with her ice cream. Phyllis, looking through the window at the girl who just walked out of the restaurant, asked Roland if she was going to be okay. Roland smiled, assuring that this place was very safe and Zero was a very smart girl too. Phyllis then began to explain that once she entered deep sleep, everything would be pitch black, and there would be no light or sound. However, this time, she arrived in this world instead. Roland thought it over since Phyllis had done this many times, and nothing strange had happened. He then realized the only difference was this time, she was within the castle, sleeping just a wall apart from him, but that couldn't be all, there must be something special. All of a sudden, both of them thought of the light pillars. That's right, since Phyllis was sleeping a wall apart from him, their light pillars must have overlapped. Roland shook his head and thought further, that's not it, the light pillar didn't fully explain everything, considering Nightingale and Anna should also have entered this world if that was the case. Engaged in a mental brainstorm, Roland suddenly had an idea. Suddenly, a loud crash was heard, interrupting what he was about to say, and what followed was shards of glass from the windows scattered across the floor. People in the restaurant and on the street panicked and fled from all directions, many being pushed and shoved around in the commotion. It turned out someone had spotted a fallen. Phyllis was confused, as Roland had just mentioned that the area was safe a minute ago. This left Roland speechless. However, he had acknowledged that he had seen increasing reports in newspapers and news about people in the dream world awakening natural forces, but most turned into uncontrollable monsters. After finishing the last bite of her burger, Phyllis asked Roland whether they should deal with the enemy first or go to the park to find Zero. Roland headed towards the back door, knowing that the park was safe for now, and they needed to confront this threat first. He explained that Phyllis should consider the enemy a kind of hybrid demon beast, which had to be defeated with the natural forces, known as magic, of this world. He later explained that in this world, both men and women could possess this power, and Roland demonstrated it. Phyllis looked at Roland in surprise. He then asked if Phyllis could use her magic. She then tried to utilize her magical energy within her. Phyllis found it difficult at first due to her prolonged disuse of this body. Soon, a powerful magical energy emanated from Phyllis, and claw-like wings appeared behind her. This was Phyllis's ability, capable of extending and retracting within her power range, sharper than any blade. It turned out that Phyllis was once a powerful combat witch who had once served as a close guard in the top 3 seats during the Takara era. As Phyllis's magic dispersed, the fallen was expected to arrive soon. The two then headed towards the back door when suddenly their surroundings exploded with a loud bang, and walls shattered as a figure appeared. Roland frowned as he saw a man charging towards Phyllis. One of his hands started to gather energy. Phyllis didn't even bother dodging. Instead, she charged at the attacker. Roland wanted to stop her, trying to remind her that she was no longer in the body of a god punishment witch. Phyllis clearly forgot all about this. When their energies collided, Phyllis was sent flying several meters back. Roland quickly caught her, absorbing the impact together. The blast sent them through several walls, finally crashing into a room. Roland, covered in dust, coughed a few times. He checked for any injuries. Aside from a numb back, he was unharmed. He then looked at Phyllis in his arms and asked how she was. Phyllis, with her head down, slowly stood up. Her clothes were torn in several places, one of her claw-like wings was ripped off, and her face was scraped. However, she didn't seem bothered, rather assured Roland that the fight would soon be over. The fallen slowly approached them, kicking aside a broken wing lying at his feet, and then with a hideous smile, he once again gathered energy in his hands while trying to attack Phyllis again. However, he failed to notice the wing he had kicked onto the side was not flying back towards him, and in the next second, before he knew it, his head had fallen to the ground. Phyllis then recalled her wing, reattaching it to her back. It turned out that as long as it was within a 5-meter range, the detached wing was even more threatening. Observing the energy in the fallen's hand, it didn't dissipate, rather just stopped spinning. She wondered if this was the natural force Roland spoke of, the magical energy of this world. Curious, she started poking at the energy and found she could pick it up. She then handed it to Roland. In Roland's hands, the energy spun rapidly before transforming into a dazzling beam of light that shot up to the ceiling, with light sparks gradually dissipating into the air. Roland was at a loss for words to explain what had just happened, perhaps suggesting it was a way of returning the magic back to the world. They quickly left the scene, as Roland did not want anyone to see what happened. Phyllis found it odd, considering they had defeated an enemy. However, Roland explained that in this era, even the most vicious of individuals could only be apprehended, locked up, and judged by designated authorities and personnel. Roland took off his jacket and draped it over Phyllis, and then they hurried away from the location. Phyllis glanced back at the ruins, only to remark on the strangeness of this era. They hadn't gone far when Roland saw Zero running against the crowd towards them, looking very worried. She tried to push through the people until she saw Roland, her expression shifting from anxiety to relief, and then immediately to anger. Roland bent down while ruffling her hair and apologizing for making her worry. Zero's cheeks flushed, she pouted, and then she grabbed onto Phyllis's hand, leading them away from the area together.